Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Back with another forecast discussion. We have a pretty significant severe weather event on tap for tomorrow across parts of southeast Texas into the southeast states. Doing this on Monday night, the night before the event tomorrow, because things might get going a little bit early. So even though we don't have the latest up-to-date data from tomorrow morning that I like to discuss, we should have enough data here to make a forecast discussion. Wanted to get it out early before things really get going tomorrow morning. So we have a kind of two enhanced risk areas here, one across southeast Texas, kind of confined to the coastal regions there, basically south and southwest of Houston. And then one across the southeast states, southeast Louisiana, far southern Mississippi, into southwest Alabama and the western Florida panhandle. Places like New Orleans, Gulfport, Biloxi, Mobile, under the gun for that second severe weather risk tomorrow. We do have a significant tornado threat, two 10% hatched areas there within those enhanced risk areas for that area south and southwest of Houston, as well as the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama area, with a large 5% and 2% area surrounding that. Also, damaging wind threat. Greatest threat is going to be in that easternmost enhanced risk area there, but there is a damaging wind threat with this particular setup all the way back into Texas. There is some chance for some significant hail there in southeast Texas, but I think the tornado and damaging wind threat is going to take precedence there. So for the southern or westernmost enhanced risk area, Houston Metro, not entirely in the actual enhanced risk area, Houston proper. Southern portions of the metro are under the gun there, so places like Pearland, Sugar Land, Texas City, down toward the coast, Galveston, Freeport, Matagorda, Palacios, Port Lavaca, even as far southwest as Corpus Christi. I would keep an eye on that. You're only in a marginal risk there in Corpus Christi, but I would keep an eye on things as we go into tomorrow morning just to be on the safe side. But the greatest threat for now is going to be to your north and northeast there. Places again like New Orleans, Morgan City, New Iberia, over toward Gulfport, Biloxi, Mobile, western Florida panhandle under the gun with that easternmost enhanced risk area as well. So let's go ahead and dive in here to some data. Let's look at our water vapor satellite imagery right away. Right away, you see a little swirl here across the desert southwest. That's going to be our little trough, little compact but very powerful trough that's going to shift its way into the southern plains, into Texas there tomorrow for our particular severe weather event. If we go to our 500 millibar map here, you can see exactly where that kind of very compact wound up trough is right here over southeast Arizona there. Very strong winds rounding the base of that trough. Still kind of a positively tilted trough, so it's still in the process of maturing, but by tomorrow we should see those winds really start to wrap around the exit region of that trough and as it ejects into Texas. And we should have a pretty potent upper trough there in play for tomorrow. Let's go down to 850 millibars here. Normally we look for our low-level jet here. We do see some swath of low-level jet there into kind of west and southwest Texas there out of the southeast. So we do have a low-level jet in place, but not a very significant one. We do have a little bit of a low-level cyclone there across kind of western Mexico, kind of the Big Bend area of Texas, but we're not seeing a very significant mass response yet from this particular system. We go back to our 500 millibar map, and you can see that the trough is still lagging back here over the desert southwest, that forcing and those westerly winds associated with this trough not quite making its way into the region. So we're not seeing a significant mass response yet with this system. We will start to see it tomorrow morning, and that is going to be key to really start pulling the moisture northward. And the moisture return with this system is what's going to keep this perhaps at bay. Take a look at our surface map here, and you can see we do have a little bit of that surface low down here across kind of the Big Bend region of Texas here. But again, not a very strong mass response with this particular surface low. That's going to change tomorrow morning. But notice the winds out across the Gulf are out of the east. We should see those start to flip around out of the southeast as we go into the morning tomorrow, but they're not quite favorable for really pulling that moisture inland. And that is what is going to hold this system back, I think. We'll take a look at our surface data here. Obviously, normally we like to see, at least mid to upper 50s dew points, usually more so in the 60s or low 70s dew points for a significant severe weather event. We don't really have that at all across Texas. You can see much of Texas here, 20s dew points up toward the Red River. increasing only to the 30s and 40s here, even along the Texas coast, where we'd expect to find stronger moisture here. Houston, Galveston, only about 40 dew point there. Corpus Christi is about 53, but still, being so close to the Gulf, you'd think we would see a higher dew point there. Even the stations in the Gulf registering dew points in the upper 40s to low 50s there. And we go back to our surface map here. We have this big surface high pressure center, centered right over kind of the Mississippi River Delta there in northwest Mississippi to western Tennessee. This is quite a bit of cold air, kind of a cold air intrusion here that's pushed all that moisture, that juicy air mass, down well into the Gulf. If we look at our temp, wind, and dew point map, you can see all the way down here are those blue and green contours associated with those 50s, 56, 60, 64 dew points. They're way down into the Gulf. So usually, normally we'd like to see that moisture already kind of in place here across the region. But because it's well into the Gulf, we're not going to see a very strong inland return of that moisture. Thankfully, with this system, that will kind of limit the overall area that is under the gun for a severe threat tomorrow. You'll notice that if we go back to that outlook, you can see it's pretty much hugging that coastal region. Because that moisture is so far down in the Gulf, we don't have that much time. We are not seeing that significant mass response yet associated with that trough until tomorrow morning. And so we should start to see that moisture creep northward overnight. By morning, we should see a pretty significant mass response here across South Texas. That will start to really pump that moisture northward. But again, we're not going to see a very strong inland intrusion of that moisture into the Gulf Coast states here for tomorrow's event. So you can see also those winds are out of the east, easterly surface winds here. Those will shift out of the southeast and really start taking that moisture up toward the north as we go into tomorrow morning. Let's look at that moisture. We'll take a look at our soundings here. This is at 0Z sounding at Brownsville. So this evening's weather balloon. You'll notice we do have a pretty deep moist layer here. It's extending up almost above 700 millibars. Kind of a rough sort of display of a moist layer here. We do have a little bit of dry intrusions here. A little bit of dry intrusion with this overall moist layer, but we do have solid moisture up here above 700 millibars. So the overall quality of the moisture is not going to be that bad. Here at the surface, you can see only 56 dew point at Brownsville. I don't have a sounding, unfortunately, from deep in the Gulf there where the best moisture is, but we do have pretty deep moisture here over South Texas, so that's a good sign as far as severe weather goes. But again, the inland intrusion of this moisture not going to be too terribly strong here, thankfully, with this system. We do see a nice kind of clockwise veering of those winds in the low levels here. Clockwise curvature in that hodograph does mean that warm advection is underway, so we're slowly starting to see that moisture advection starting to happen here across the very south tip of Texas into the Gulf, and that should increase by tomorrow morning as we talked about here. So overall moisture is fairly deep. That's going to be a plus with this system, but the low surface moisture not going to be able to make it that far inland, thankfully, with this particular system. So let's look at some data here. This is the 18Z NAM. Let me see quick if the 0Z run is out far enough. It's only in 7%, so I'm going to use the 18Z run here for now. Shouldn't be too much change. You can see where that trough, that 500 millibar trough is here. Strong winds surrounding the base of that trough. Going to shift into Texas by tomorrow morning. This is 15Z, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time. We start to see that edge of the forcing here creeping into south central and southeast Texas there. So things should probably get underway, start becoming a little bit more robust by about 9, 10, 11 a.m. before the event really gets into full swing there across the Texas portion. By early midday to early afternoon. This trough, very compact, very strong, potent trough here, shifting east with time. Very strong winds aloft there as it spreads into the southeast. The easternmost portion of this enhanced risk is going to be more of an evening to overnight event as the forcing lags a little bit behind here. Texas going to be our daytime portion of the event, moving off toward the east. That should be our kind of nighttime portion of the event as it shifts off toward the east. Very strong trough here, very compact but very strong trough associated with this particular system. That means kind of a lot of forcing associated with this system, so we may see a little bit of a mess here, kind of a mixed mode event, given the progressive nature of this trough and the overall very strong forcing associated with it. So that may have some impact on storm mode overall. Take a look at our low-level jet here. You can see overnight gradual increase, and then by morning we do get that kind of mass response here. This is early morning. Tuesday, we start to see those 50, 60 knot winds here across south central Texas that will really start to pump that moisture in the low levels northward. And then by 15 to 18Z, very potent low level jet here across the region out of the south. That is what, 50, 60, 65 plus knots of flow here in those pink colors there across south and southeast Texas. So very strong low-level shear. We know what that low-level jet does. It really pumps that low-level moisture northward, but it really increases the low-level shear for a potential tornado, perhaps strong tornado threat in a given environment. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. Low-level jet, let me go back here. Low-level jet is going to continue to be strong as we go into the overnight hours into the southeast. Very strong flow here. You can see that wind bar, 50, 60, 70, 80 knots there. Just a kilometer off the surface. That is ridiculous. But again, fortunately, the overall warm sector not going to be able to go inland that much, thankfully. If we had these profiles over a very broad warm sector, if this was April or May, we'd be talking about a very high-end event on tap for sure. Let's look at our surface pattern here. You can see by about 12Z, 6 a.m. Central Standard Time, we really start to see that surface low development out across far south Texas. Those winds start to flip around out of the southeast more by 15Z. We really start to pull that moisture northward. Very compact surface low. We'll move off toward the east quickly with time. So very potent surface low. Those low-level winds backed for sure. Right out ahead of it, a little bit of a warm front there, cold front out there. So very broad warm sector, but most of it's going to be over the Gulf, thankfully, with this particular system. Low moves off toward the northeast with time, kind of pinches off eventually with time, and it should be a not terribly long durations of severe threat for Texas, and then we should be, given the progressive nature of this system, not a terribly long durations severe threat overall with this system. Let's zoom into the moisture. You can see those blue colors there start to creep northward overnight tonight into tomorrow morning. And then by about 15Z, we've got that warm sector on land here, far south Texas, toward the Corpus Christi area. Here's Corpus Christi. Here is Houston. Here is Galveston right in there. So you can see by 15Z, 9 a.m., we have a nice portion of the warm sector that is inland. This area of Texas not under a severe weather risk right now, but again, I would watch for areas, Corpus Christi, maybe just toward the northwest, and areas around Corpus Christi. Be on alert for some severe storms starting about mid to late morning tomorrow morning, just to be on the safe side. And then we should, by 18Z, start to get things really cooking here, this warm sector. Again, not super broad here inland. We probably will see a lot of severe storms here out over the open Gulf. But again, given that the moisture is starting all the way down here into the Gulf, we're not going to see, and that surface low starts to develop tomorrow morning, we're not going to see a long duration period where that moisture is able to get far inland. Again, if this was April or May, we'd see the warm sector all the way up here, well into Texas, and we'd be talking about a very high-end event here. Not a very broad warm sector here, and by about 0Z, by about sunset or so, late afternoon to early evening, the threat for Texas will be over. Then we start to see maybe a little bit of a lull as the warm sector mainly stays mostly offshore there, maybe places like Lake Charles, Beaumont, Orange City there in far southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana may see a little bit of warm sector onshore, but most of the activity should be over the Gulf here by kind of early evening, and then we see a second surge of that warm sector inland for places like southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama into the Florida Panhandle by between about 3 and 6Z or so. So, after right about bedtime for most of you and going into the overnight hours, we should see that severe threat ramp back up across southeast Louisiana, places like New Orleans, Biloxi, Gulfport, into the Mobile area. Come the overnight hours on into the early morning hours Wednesday. So let's take a sounding here. This is at 21Z. We'll take a sounding at just south of Houston, and this will show you why this event could have been so much more potent if we had a much broader warm sector here. Notice we do have quite a bit of instability here. Very deep moist layer extending up again above 700 millibars there. Very deep low-level moisture. Solid instability there, over 1,200 joules per kilogram of mixed layer cape there. So very nice looking instability profiles. Probably going to be a lot of clouds around. So we're going to have to rely, instead of that surface heating from the sun that we like to see on most severe weather days, we're probably not going to get that tomorrow. Probably going to be socked in clouds for quite a bit of the day, and therefore we're going to have to rely on this strong low-level moist warm air advection to destabilize the atmosphere. And that should take place. We should have at least modest instability in place. But fairly weak low-level lapse rates may keep things a little bit at bay, although 6.2 from 0 to 3 kilometers is fairly adequate for a robust severe threat. So decent instability. But just look at this wind profile here. This is, if you were to tell me if I were to tell you, show me a hodograph that is pretty textbook for a significant tornado threat, you might show me this one. This is just absolutely off the charts here. Very strong flow in the low levels, very strong curvature there in the low levels. Effective storm relative helicity, that spin in the atmosphere, over 650 meters square per second square. Just to put that in perspective, usually a rule of thumb for the effective SRH value that we like to see for just a tornado threat is 150 meters squared per second squared. We're seeing over 650. That is just ridiculous here. And you can see this hodograph, huge curvature there in the low levels, very strong veering of those winds, and veering and strengthening of those winds in the low levels. Deep layer shear, more than adequate for supercells. This will definitely foster a strong tornado threat, given decent instability development there across the small but potent warm sector. So anybody in the open warm sector is going to be under the gun for a strong tornado threat, as well as damaging winds here. And again, if we had these kind of wind profiles over a much broader area, this was April or May, we had that warm sector really going inland here into the southern plains, then we'd be talking about a significant severe weather risk here. So the Texas threat, any storm here going to have the chance of producing damaging winds and tornadoes, perhaps some strong here. Again, given the amount of forcing with this overall very compact, very strong trough, I do think the storm mode may be a little bit messy. We should get kind of a line of storms here out along the main kind of frontal zone there. We can check the shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. You can see we do have a decent amount, though, that is kind of perpendicular to the boundary there. So that is a little bit concerning. We may have more of a broken line out here across the sort of main frontal zone, with the potential for some discrete storms, perhaps firing out here in confluence bands out ahead of the main front in the Gulf. So that is something to watch for sure. But again, given the overall forcing with this system, I do think that we should see more of a line of storms along the main front and not a ton of room, at least inland, for discrete storms out in the open warm sector. Out in the open Gulf, I would not be surprised to see several bands of supercells, discrete supercells here, producing some pretty strong velocity couplets, supercellular water spouts here over in the open Gulf. But again, thankfully, that overall warm sector not making its way inland, terribly far inland here with this particular setup. Again, might see a little bit of a lull there, and then we'll see a secondary surge of this warm sector inland there across southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, into southwest Alabama. Let's take a sounding from here. Equally impressive wind profiles here. Effective storm relative helicity over 600 meters square per second square. Again, very strong veering, very strong strengthening of the winds there in the low levels. Very just impressive looking hodographs there with this particular setup. Instability may be a little bit weaker with this eastern mode across the southeast states, but definitely adequate for severe weather. We don't need a lot of instability with these kind of wind profiles in these kind of cold season events. So something to watch for sure. And again, given the overall progression of the system, may be kind of a mixed mode event, kind of a line or broken line of storms along that main front, with maybe some room for some prefrontal discrete storms moving on shore here across southern Mississippi into southern Alabama, western Florida panhandle in the overnight to early morning hours Wednesday. So let's take a look now at some high resolution data. This is going to be the 0ZHRRR. 0ZHRRR, so it kind of shows you what we might see, kind of an estimate of the radar. Again, take this with a grain of salt. I don't like to use cams until at least the day of the event. So take this with a grain of salt. Could see some rumbles of thunder here. Again, this is all going to be snowfall out here across West Texas. We'll have a significant winter weather portion of this event across kind of the northwest quadrant of Texas into Oklahoma. But we could have some storms here, some rumbles of thunder for central to northern to central and south central Texas as we get some kind of warm advection stuff north of the front. And by about 15, 16, 17 Z there, 9, 10, 11 a.m., you start to see an increase in the intensity of these storms out across south central Texas. And we kind of get this kind of broken band here out across south central Texas with some evidence for discrete storm development out here in the small but potent open warm sector. And those are going to have the greatest threat. If we can get these prefrontal discrete supercells to fire, they will have the greatest threat for a significant tornado threat. But again, we'll have to watch that to see if that does come to fruition. Kind of get a line of storms to consolidate as this moves off toward the east. Damaging wind threat for sure. Embedded tornadoes as well. We'll still have to watch for any discrete supercells out ahead of this line as it moves off toward the east. Again, that's kind of surge of that warm sector northward overnight. continue on with that line, and maybe again potential for some discrete storms out here ahead of the line. We'll have to watch for as it moves into Alabama, western Florida Panhandle. Let's take a look at the ARW here just for kicks, just so we get kind of an ensemble look at the data. Kind of the same thing, lots of storms fire early on. We get kind of a line of storms there along the main front, potential for some little beans out ahead of the line. We'll have to watch for a greater tornado and damaging wind threat. Line moves off toward the east, pretty similar progression there as it moves off into the southeast states. So pretty good agreement among the cams here. These are going to be the 12Z runs, the 0Z runs of these ARW and NSSL models are not quite out yet. Same thing here on the NSSL WRF, line of storms here, maybe some embedded rotation, embedded tornadoes, damaging wind, chance for some discrete storms out ahead. That moves off into the southeast in the overnight hours into Wednesday morning. So I've been looking at this event and looking at a pretty interesting analog, and that is the Christmas Day 2012 event across the southeast. Very similar setup here. Produced a number of tornadoes, 60 tornado reports across East Texas into Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, including a strong tornado that moved through Mobile that actually was captured on some tower cam footage. Let me see if I can bring that up. And yeah, you can see pretty significant looking tornado there in Mobile on Christmas Day 2012 from this particular system. It looked pretty close to me throughout my time kind of forecasting this particular system. Take a look at the overall setup here. Very kind of compact trough here. This is 500 millibars. And you can see very compact trough, very strong trough here. Strong winds surrounding the base of that trough. Very compact sort of closed wave here moving into the southeast. Kind of centered, exit region centered here on that, kind of where our enhanced risk area is for tomorrow. And you can see very kind of similar looking trough there to our event tomorrow. Let me pull up the NAM 500 millibar data for tomorrow. Very kind of similar looking setup here. It does kind of eject off toward the northeast a little bit with time, but overall you can see a pretty similar looking setup with these two different events. Let me go down to 850 millibars here, and you can see that low-level jet very, very strong here with this particular event, 50 knots or so out across this region, out ahead, very consolidated low-level cyclone there. And we have our surface fields looking pretty similar with that kind of moisture, that warm sector, kind of confined here to kind of the coastal regions right ahead of that potent surface low there. So very similar looking setup here, and this produced quite a few tornadoes out here, including that damaging one there near Mobile. So just kind of an analog that I've been looking at, very similar to this particular event tomorrow. And overall, it's going to be a pretty potent event. Again, two areas of enhanced risk for now. One across southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, into southern Alabama and the western Florida Panhandle. And one here for our early day stuff, mid-afternoon or mid-morning to mid-afternoon here across southeast Texas, kind of south and southwest of Houston. All severe hazards, including the threat for strong tornadoes, on tap with both of these threat areas, damaging winds as well. Maybe some hail, although I think, again, damaging winds and tornadoes going to be the most pertinent threats for tomorrow. With those under the gun here, this early day threat going to be anywhere as far west as Corpus Christi, up the coast toward Galveston and Houston Metro, southern portions of the Houston Metro within that enhanced risk area there. And overall, these lines could shift some. We could see a little bit farther inland surge of that moisture. We could maybe not see as far inland of that surge of moisture. And it's all going to depend on that in the morning. We'll know more in the morning about where that line and where that warm sector is going to set up. For now, these are where the lines are drawn. Threat is going to move into the southeast. Again, kind of a mixed mode event. We'll have to watch closely for discrete storms ahead of the main line along the cold front for that greatest significant tornado threat. Moving into the southeast, right about sunset and after into the overnight hours there. All hazards threat with those storms, mostly a damaging wind and tornado threat, perhaps some strong there from southeast Louisiana into the western Florida Panhandle. So that's going to do it for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.